reflections on sources that I've come across in the process of researching my book, which is actually on African-American kind of alliance building in the 1930s. And so I'll begin then with some more familiar material, at least myself, which is Langston Hughes's iconic 1936 poem, Let America Be America Again, where Hughes implicates a diversity of figures as symbols of America, and among those, the coexistence of two groups is particularly jarring. He refers to a pioneer on the plain and the red man driven from the land in this picture or portrait of a dispossessed America. So Hughes's poem is a seminal artifact of popular front literary culture. It presents a radical democratic challenge to dominant racist and capitalist definitions of Americanism, and taking it as representative of a cultural movement, Let America Be America Again, points toward an ambiguity, a persistent ambiguity in what Michael Denning has called the cultural front, a leftist kind of, a labor and leftist kind of cultural formation emerging in the 1930s. The visibility and sympathetic portrayal of Native Americans in Hughes's poem indicates that he was attentive to racialized dispossession as one of the conditions of possibility for the modern United States. Even so, the poem leaves intact the mythology of this heroic pioneer whose settlement of unoccupied plains relied on the driving of the red man from the same land. The poem concludes with a vision of an America in which multiple structures of racialized class domination are overcome by a radically re-envisioned people or populace, which includes all of those who are excluded at the foundation of the Republic. The poem seeks to call into being an insurgent constituency then that includes impoverished settlers, exploited arrivants, and dispossessed indigenous people. But the symbolic repertoire of this poem indicates as well some of the persistent difficulties and tensions in this projected popular alliance. And these unresolved tensions then are commonplace in popular front cultural production, which despite its attentiveness to problems of racial oppression, didn't present or demonstrate a kind of consistent and sympathetic concern with native life. Even so, by situating Hughes and other African Americans in a culture of cosmopolitan resistance, as I do in my book project, a culture which far overgrew and established expansive solidarities beyond Black diasporic networks, I found evidence that Indigenous activists sought to connect with the expansive protest culture of the Depression years. And as they did so, Indigenous leftists generated their own commentaries on Americanism, a word in wide circulation at the time, and one that was increasingly debated as labor and racial radicals contended with the limitations of and the possibilities generated by New Deal politics. So I'll make an effort to change the.
Right. Do you want to go to slide zero? Yeah, I'll just.
So recent work by, I'm not wholly alone in making some of these observations, recent work by Benjamin Balthazar as well as Elizabeth Stein has paved the way for a reassessment of the hitherto dominant assumption that the popular front milieu, which was arranged around but wasn't contained by the Communist Party, had nothing to do with Indigenous struggles during the interwar period. Balthazar's work, notably his book Anti-Imperialist Modernism, recovers and reframes the Nez Perce anthropologist Archie Finney as a cosmopolitan modernist whose influential writings incorporated insights that were learned during a study in the Soviet Union. So according to Balthazar, Finney's materialist theory of native sovereignty testifies that histories of indigenous resistance and socialist politics were more conjoined in Depression-era North America than has otherwise been assumed. Notably, for the purposes of this paper, where Americanism is a central concern, Finney's most famous essay, which is titled Namapu Among the White Settlers and was written in 1937, in this paper, he kind of engages debates about Americanism. So Finney's essay reviews the situation of Native Americans in a period of liberalizing reform, the period of the Indian New Deal, during which a new administration took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, and Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, which instituted some limited forms of sovereignty and self-governance for Native tribes. Like many Native Americans, Finney welcomed the move away from forced assimilation and the introduction of new structures of governance for Indian peoples, which were based on the preservation rather than the dissolution of tribal group identities. But he was critical of attempts to incorporate Native Americans into a capitalist economy, which he insisted would result only in introducing indigenous people at the lowest rung of the class structure. Finney also articulated an indigenous politics then that maps onto what Kevin Boyneil has called the third space of sovereignty, founded on the simultaneous rejection of, quoting Finney, indiscriminate absorption by the general white population and, quote, the reservation existence of befeathered museum specimens. So Finney understood the duty of government policy as being to help Indigenous Americans, quote, become alert modern communities struggling for their own interests. His effort to forge a new understanding of Indigenous peoples' place involved critical and ironic engagement with ideas about Americanism. So, for instance, Finney attacked the conservative American Indian Federation for their right-wing criticisms of the Indian New Deal. The AIF, which was one among several Native American organizations at the time, claimed that the New Deal was undermining Americanism by, quote, introducing communism. And these positions rendered the AIF, in Finney's eyes, as reckless, unprincipled, and absurdly reactionary. That's a valid conclusion, given that some of its leading members were associated with Nazism. He regarded more ambiguously the kind of popular romanticization of Indigenous peoples as 100% Americans, or kind of original Americans. On one hand, he understood this romantic attachment to the figure of the Indian as one of the sources of sympathetic concern among New Deal reformers. So Finney described the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, John Collier, as representative of a trend for, quote, public-spirited citizens to redress the degeneration, misery, and injustice of a glorified population. At the same time, he deployed the term 100% Americans to address the ambiguous situation of Native Americans, who, whilst symbolically were important subjects of the American state, for the most part, were not central participants or contributors to that state's development. So Finney describes, quote, Negro and white citizens existing under inhuman conditions of misery and poverty while working as, quote, active components of capitalist society. And he contrasts this with, quote, Indians who have been reduced to the same wretched level, but those 100% Americans are not participants in capitalist society, at least not as proletarians, tenants, and farmers, in his terms. So Finney was interested in the strategic opportunities that was opened up by this romanticization of Indians as the most authentic of all Americans, and he opposed the reactionary deployment of patriotic rhetoric to undermine and attack indigenous forms of economic and political and social organization as communistic. But in his most famous essays in the 1930s, he doesn't himself participate in debates about the meaning or content of Americanism. That trend was evident elsewhere in the left. So Finney's writing represents the most complete and creative effort in this era to apply categories of Marxist materialism to the problem of American settler colonialism. But Finney himself wasn't a committed communist. He had some complex views on the Soviet Union and on the Communist Party. But he wasn't the only Indian voice on the left at this time. His work instead, I think, needs to be read as part of an enlivening culture of Marxian theorizing around race and nation quite broadly in the United States through this era. So throughout this era, the Communist Party of the USA was a dynamic political force, which was at the center of an interracial leftist political and cultural movement, the Popular Front. The party was partially motivated to transform itself into a kind of engine for anti-racist activism by the Communist International, which in 1928 adopted a black belt thesis, wherein they characterized the African Americans as an oppressed national minority, therefore envisioning them as possessing full rights to self-determination, up to and including the formation of a separate black state in the South. So the black belt thesis has famously been dismissed as a kind of clumsy effort by numerous scholars as well as activists, as a clumsy effort to kind of transpose European logics onto American racial politics. But it had one important and desired effect in convincing the American Party that it ought to focus significant resources on the organization of black farmers, sharecroppers, workers, and unemployed in a range of unions and campaigning organizations. And the efforts that the CPUSA made in this direction transformed it into a central actor in this wider kind of leftist reorientation of American society at multiple levels. And whilst the fate of the CPUSA shifted through the 30s and 40s as a result of changes in communist policy, as well as, of course, the rise of the Second Red Scare, the black belt thesis stimulated expansive theoretical debates for many years to come. It proved a kind of foil or a kind of negative stimulant for theorists like C.L.R. James, it also proved a much more kind of positive source of inspiration for somebody like Claudia Jones theorizing race, gender, class, and imperialism together. So the effort then to think seriously and the mandate to respond more creatively to racial questions through a Marxist lens in this era also led in 1938 to the publication in The Communist of an essay titled The Mexican Question in the Southwest. And here a Mexican-American union organizer, Emma Tenayuca, worked with her partner in politics and in romance, Rehoma Brooks, to present comparisons between the structural position of Mexican and African Americans. They argued that Mexican Americans were an oppressed minority group, but not one with nationalist aspirations. And this set a precedent for later Chicano revolutionary politics. It also demonstrated an emerging effort to theorize American society as a distinct form of kind of plurinational formation, as its own kind of prison house of peoples. Indigenous Americans aren't typically understood as being central or significant participants and subjects in this era of radical intellectual production. The commonplace assumption of Indian absence rests on a not insubstantial bedrock of truth. The Communist Party and other groups of the American left were not hugely attentive to or in close contact with Native Americans through much of this period. And the absence was one which at least some communist cadres were conscious of. So this article, for example, expresses the regret of one communist newspaper in the West, in California, the Western Worker, where they advertised on the 20th of May 1937 an appeal and expressed their regret that they lacked adequate information, quote, on the rights and problems of the Indians of California. So the editors explain in this note that their ignorance prevented them from producing any authoritative article on the subject, despite requests from readers for a study of that kind. But they appealed to more knowledgeable readers for, quote, cooperation in remedying that situation. They declare that, quote, any Indians who wish to write of their problems will find the columns of the Western Worker open to them. More than absence, though, there's also just a significant degree of confusion and inconsistency in communist writing on the topic through this period. So while the appeal for more substantial material by and about Indigenous people doesn't appear to have been very fruitful for the CPUSA, the Western Worker does bear some traces of conversations that were being had on the left about the situation of Native Americans. For instance, the request for more material was printed alongside a letter from a Native person in Oroville who asked that the Western Worker lend its resources to demand that the government finally make good, quote, on the money it promised in its treaties with Native peoples. The writer was specifically animated against the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whose liberal pro-New Deal head, John Collier, is suspected as being part of a conspiracy to financially leech off the Indians while, quote, trying to railroad the Indians to reservations. So this correspondent is hostile to the Indian New Deal in a way that implies maybe some form of assimilationist position, or at least it seems to be deprioritizing native sovereignty in a context of kind of reforms that are moving toward some kind of recognition of native sovereignty. In sharp contrast, non-native Communist Party member Irving Kreutzberg writes in 1932 in the same newspaper on a different issue, but kind of takes for granted in passing that Native Americans constitute a national minority with associated rights, therefore, to cultural autonomy, and makes a comparison between them and French Canadians, and in a more central and original argument for him, Mexican Americans in the Southwest. So there are various efforts then, and assumptions about the appropriate way of understanding Native American oppression and poverty in 1930s America. Further study of the Western Worker demonstrates that some Communist Party members were themselves also Native American, and that this contingent could articulate a distinctive vision of communism, Americanism, and the relationship between these. So Joe Manzanares, a Communist Party activist in San Francisco who identified himself as an Indian, issued an appeal to fellow Indigenous readers of the Western Worker. This was published shortly after Kreutzberg's article making a passing reference to them. The appeal characterizes European settlement of Turtle Island as a crime committed by, quote, white bosses who stole the land of the Indigenous people, refused them citizenship, quote, locked them up in parks or reservations, and then continued to steal their natural resources so that, quote, soon we will die of poverty. Manzanares' appeal makes no specific programmatic commitment around Indigenous sovereignty again, but it insisted that the communists were the only party, quote, leading the fight of all races for freedom and equality by, quote, bringing together Negroes, Mexicans, and foreign-born workers together in a struggle for, quote, workers and farmers' government. Manzanares' appeal tracks with the tendency in other reports on Indian affairs, which dot the Western Workers' reportage, in an effort to square a recognition of historical settler violence and dispossession with a framing of contemporary Indian issues as one of a set of problems of racial discrimination and governmental neglect. And this approach then facilitates interracial solidarity around campaigns, for example, for expanded state welfare and for racial equality, but it skirts around questions of cultural autonomy and political rights to sovereignty. These questions then are still not programmatically addressed in any explicit way, but in the correspondence of this guy, Vincent Spotted Eagle. But his letter to the Western Worker gives an additional indication of how a degree of sophistication in the effort being made at this time to reckon with indigeneity, Americanism, and communism. So Vincent Spotted Eagle is the name of a man who wrote to the newspaper, and he did so in the context of kind of responding to a speech made by Upton Sinclair in Pasadena. Upton Sinclair, the famous author who at this point was launching a gubernatorial campaign called End Poverty in California. So in this speech, Sinclair rejected, quote, communism because it's un-American. Spotted Eagle's response was to observe that as, quote, an American Indian, he was more American than Sinclair ever thought of being. American Indians, Spotted Eagle wrote, are 100% Americans, whereas Sinclair and other whites were, quote, original products of Europe. So too, the capitalist mode of production, he said, is a European invention with no autochthonous base in the Americas. Spotted Eagle imagined communism as a restoration then of pre-Columbian social relations, arguing that, quote, before the white man came, our mode of production and distribution were on a cooperative basis without any exploitation. And this, he said, is communism, which is true Americanism. And this then serves to justify his membership of the Communist Party. Spotted Eagle then identified Sinclair's reformist program as a mode of kind of settler socialism, founded on a denial of indigenous realities. His appropriation of the term 100% American fits into a pattern of indigenous discursive practices throughout this era, but he repurposes it in a champion that marks Spotted Eagle's intervention as a rare and important one to the history of indigenous radicalism. It also, I think, represents a notable anticipation with an important difference of the famous and you might say notorious popular front era slogan of the Communist Party of the USA, where they proclaimed from 1936 on that, quote, communism is 20th century Americanism, as part of attack toward more kind of class collaborationist and patriotic anti-fascism. So in Spotted Eagle's rendering, communist Americanism is an anti-colonial and revolutionary revelation about the settler character of the United States and of US capitalism. His reframing of Americanism facilitates an indigenizing communization of land and other resources, even if it doesn't produce any direct claim to native sovereignty over those resources. There's also a distinct and subversive universalism in Spotted Eagle's letter. So whereas Sinclair's socialism appears kind of particularistic and parochial, Spotted Eagle positions, quote, American Indians as lovers of all humanity, especially the Negroes, who are the most exploited race in this country. Quoting Chief Whitecalf of the Blackfoot Nation, Spotted Eagle repudiates an Americanism that's tied to any settler nation state. He says the flags of the white men are the emblems of intolerance. So Vincent Spotted Eagle's small missive then to the Western Worker raises a rare and important insight into the kinds of political intervention being made by indigenous Americans on the left through the turbulent Depression years. And it's indicative of what an indigenous communism might look like in the American setting, or an anticipation of later elaborations on this idea. As anti-nationalist as it is American, and as rapaciously universalist as it is deeply anti-colonial. This, nevertheless, ought only to be a departure point, I think, for the writing of indigeneity into the history of interwar American radicalism. And I thought I'd end with a kind of reflection on where this ought, I think, to go. So in a separate article, another man who identifies as a member of the Spotted Eagle family, but who signs the letter using his non-native name, Albert F. Gray, raises a tantalizing further hint at native participation in the interwar left. So writing to the Western Worker, this man, Albert Gray, describes a correspondence with his brother, who expressed hostility to Albert's Communist Party membership because he opposes communism's atheistic character. But after reading communist pamphlets, Gray's brother was once the party. Albert Gray reports having recently read in the Daily Worker of Raymond F. Gray, which is the brother that he's been corresponding with, announcing his candidacy on behalf of the CPUSA for a seat in the US Senate representing Montana. That is the brother, that's Raymond Gray, and he was the leader of an organization of landless Indians in Montana. He went on to author A History of the Cree Nation in the early 1940s. And it seems to me that this history of the Chippewa family, who were dispossessed and landless in part because their people kind of straddled the US-Canadian border, and who, some of whom at least, were drawn for a time into the orbit of world communism, that this kind of family story might tell us a little bit more about communism and Americanism in the 20th century. Thank you.
Basically, it's actually like a money problem, but well, that's the thing of working at a third world university. Well, I hope my presentation will connect to what we heard earlier today. We're hearing about a bit about plurinationality. I'm not going to focus on plurinationality, but of course it is connected with what I am going to present today. Well, what I am presenting is, I hope it will be a book. The manuscript is ready, and I'm waiting for the publisher to come back to me. So maybe you can read about this in a few months. Let's see. And if you hate it, just tell me so I can still change things. Well, the thing is, I'm going to talk about the indigenous movement in Ecuador and how it moves between whether socialist or even communist positions and a position closer to autonomy and plurinationality and maybe ethnic demands. So in order to do so, we have to dive a bit into a revision of what the indigenous movement was and how it developed. It started as a modern social movement in the 1920s, and it was, well, always rather close to socialism and leftist positions, because it was a labor union or workers' union of rural indigenous workers that fought against the Hacienda Wasipungaje, which was a semi-feudal form of well, unfree labor. And they fought for a land reform, a agrarian reform. This is why the first organizations of the indigenous movement were rather clearly left-wing, like the FEI, founded in 1944. There was an Ecuadoriana de Indios, which is openly communist and part of the communist labor union of this moment. FENOC and Ecuador, which were created in the late 60s and early 70s, started as conservative Catholic organizations, but moved to a rather socialist take in the middle or late 70s. So you always have like a rather leftist take on the indigenous movement, but without excluding ethnic aspects. Already FEI is criticizing, in the 40s, is criticizing racism, discrimination, exclusion of indigenous people as indigenous and not only as rural proletariat. Well, so you have this background with like some ethnic aspects and also some socialist aspects that in the 1980s comes together to what is called the double dimension. Between 1980 and 1986, CONAIE, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, is formed. 1980 is an early organization created, which will later on lead to CONAIE of 86, until now the dominant indigenous organization in Ecuador. And already since the beginning, actually since the late 70s, the idea is an idea of double dimension. You have an oppression of the indigenous people as ethnicity, and you have an exploitation of them as a social class. So those two concepts come together in a discourse that is really, I think, really well developed and really detailed, with concepts, some of them we already heard earlier today, with Chris, like indigenous nationalities. In Ecuador, it's not nation, but nationality, which is connected to the debates of the Communist International. You have it in the Austro-Marxist, Otto Bauer, for instance. The idea of territorial autonomy, and above all, the idea of plurinationality. Plurinationality reorganization of the state that would respect territorial autonomy for the indigenous nationalities in their territories, and also territorial autonomy for other ethnic groups, even if this is one idea that disappeared later on. So, well, if you want, you have like an opening of a socialist platform to also ethnic demands without losing this leftist and socialist idea. At the same time, just like one comment, there's also a rather conservative organization forming, FEINE, which is an organization of indigenous Protestant churches. So they certainly are not socialist and would reject me calling them socialist, but they are also close to this discourse. Of course, not talking about exploitation, but they also have like social demands. In the 1990s, which I will not talk much about, is like the high times of the indigenous movement in Ecuador. You have national uprisings in 1990, 1994, a really big march from the Amazon in 92, in 97, and the year, well, 99 and 2000, in January of 2000, presidents are ousted by wide mobilizations, including and led, at least in part, by the indigenous movement. So it is really, really present. There's a lot of things going on. They are also really present with the demands. Everyone is talking about plurinationality since the uprising of 1990, where plurinationality was one of the demands to include the idea of plurinationality in the constitution. In 94, CONAIE published its political project where it develops what plurinationality means and other demands of them. So it's like really, really present in public discourse, publications coming out that treat those concepts, those ideas, and the movement, which in the 1980s was not as much studied as later on. There are some publications of the 80s, but the 1990s, like everyone is indigenous movement. Also connected to the attention created by the Zapatistas, obviously, but after 94. But well, it's a movement on its own with a lot of importance and a lot of people debating on it, researching it. Basically until the crisis that comes later on. At the same time, the indigenous movement has much more direct influence through state organizations, state agencies under control of the indigenous organizations, especially in education, in health, and in development. It starts in the late 80s, in the 1990s, several of those organizations are created, and basically all are shut down in 2009 or 2010 by the government of Korea, but the next slide. Also, the first indigenous party, political party is formed, Pachakutik, Movimiento de Unidad Plurinacional Pachakutik, the movement of plurinational unity, Pachakutik, which is clearly a leftist party, and well, connected to other leftist parties, socialist party, some parties that are supposedly communists, and so on and so on. So you have like a really present indigenous movement with a lot of, well, let's say social demands and connection to a wider society while maintaining their demands of plurinationality, territorial autonomy. For instance, the March of 92 was connected to the demand of territory in the Amazon, that the state should recognize indigenous territories in the Amazon as such, which later happened. They gave them millions and millions of hectares of land to the indigenous organizations of Pastaza, which is one province of the Amazon. But more interesting for me is what happens next. Because, well, I'm not sure about it, actually, but some people who supposedly know the movement very well say that in the late 90s, the demands of the indigenous movement moved from a rather socialist platform to a rather ethnic one, supposedly pushed by NGOs. So the idea of ethno development and so on. The idea was that if you present yourself as indigenous, you can have access to funds and to attention and to influence, and you are able to, well, go somewhere in life. So supposedly, as the indigenous movement moved towards a more ethnic platform, leaving behind some of the socialist demands of earlier times. Since about 95, more or less, it's connected to one president of CONAIE, Antonio Vargas, who was president from 95 to 2001 of CONAIE. The biggest organization. So he had quite some influence, and supposedly he was one of several people connected to this idea of a rather ethnic demand. This also is connected to a radicalization of some of the earlier demands. For instance, territory, starting in 97, is understood not only as a territory as such, but including the soil and what is below the soil, and even the air above the territory. So it's like a radical conception of territorial autonomy that obviously shocks with a lot of other social actors that are not indigenous, and even indigenous actors that, well, obviously you can't like integrate a lot of territories with sovereignty on even in the air in one nation state or even a plurinational state. Problems connected to this. Well, since the early 2000s, the indigenous movement enters into a crisis. Here we go, which is at the beginning a leadership crisis connected to, well, the problem to connect the leadership of the indigenous organizations to the bases. They are unable to mobilize. This is also one problem. Vargas himself in 2001 failed calling for major uprisings, and nobody came, which is really, really bad. And the situation continued for several years. Especially during the government of Rafael Correa, you have a much more clearer, I think it's a demobilization strategy. You can fight me on that if you want to. Maybe not everything of this 4 points written up there are a part of a clear strategy, but, well, the effect is demobilization. You have the occupation of the discursive space of the indigenous movement by government actors. Plurinationality and interculturality are included into the constitution and public policy. So basically, they lose the meaning they had before. Nowadays, Ecuador is a plurinational state, but if you look for what plurinationality was for CONAIE in 94 or 97 or 2001 or even 88, the law of nationalities, you won't find it here. This plurinationality means something else nowadays. The same goes with interculturality, the same goes with the famous Buen Vivir. Indigenous nationalities, well, and territorial autonomy, all those concepts are included in the constitution, in public policy, in public discourse, political discourse, but with a different meaning. So the indigenous movement loses its central concepts and is basically left without a proper language. You have the destruction of the indigenous institutions. I already told you, the agency for education, for health, for development are destroyed in different ways. They disappear or lose their autonomy. You have a weakening of established organizations, a constant attack on CONAIE. They even tried to take away the building of CONAIE in Quito in 2015, which was like a major scandal on an international level. And they tried to create parallel organizations. So other indigenous organizations that actually did not survive for very long, but well, there was an attempt to weaken the organizations. And well, the last, I don't know if it's really a demobilization strategy, but it did demobilize, was the idea of addressing the grievances of the indigenous population in terms of the state, where the indigenous populations did not work through their organizations, but individually or on a local level. And well, they had an increase in income, poverty went down, access to education went up, and so on and so on. So people had, well, simply less motivation to mobilize. So during this time, the indigenous organization, the indigenous movement enters into a crisis and only is able to recover after 2010 slowly by, well, defending its discursive space and saying, for instance, then Delphine Tenesaka was president of Ecuador at that time, the Organization of the Highlands. He attacked the government of Korea by saying that they are not really socialists. They are not really socialists because they do not respect the autonomy of the indigenous nationalities. They do not respect territory, indigenous territory, and they do not respect Pachamama. Like the idea, they don't know how to translate it. The idea of a cosmos where human beings, nature, society, individuals are connected as such. So they try to reproduce and re-strengthen their own platform. And well, they actually do change several things. For instance, they redefine the idea of summa causae, which would be buen vivir, but actually is not buen vivir. Buen vivir was a translation of summa causae to Spanish. That's a good life or something. And after 2010, the indigenous movement says, well, what the government is selling as buen vivir is actually a European idea of well-being. It's nice and everything, but it's not what summa causae says. There's not this idea of community and communitarianism, which becomes much more important for the indigenous movement after this moment. In the first time of this revival after 2010, the indigenous movement mobilizes alongside environmentalists. For instance, the Yasuni initiative and the Yasunidos would be one ally, but not only them, there are also other allies fighting for water, for instance, access to water, or land also, which are not always indigenous, so they have like one opening to ecologism, environmentalism, but well, then comes the surprise. The surprise is this one, the uprising of October 2019, where this ecologistic environmentalists' ideas are not so present. Just shortly, uprising of 11 days, some people died, whether high number of injuries, people shooting, police shooting directly at the faces of protesters and leaving at least a dozen people without sight or without an eye, like I don't know, like the tendency of this time. Same thing happening in Chile, same thing happening in Colombia right after. This uprising of October is spontaneous. It's not planned as such. It was like rather spontaneous because the government at the time of Lenin Moreno, the successor of Correa and supposedly part of his organization, but later on not so much. Well, he put forward some neoliberal politics measures, including the elimination of subsidies on gasoline and diesel, which was demanded by the Monetary Fund, that basically made the government do it. And this came rather spontaneously. It wasn't really prepared and really obvious. So October 1, the subsidies are taken away, and October 3, the whole country is closed down by protests. The thing is of this uprising of October that the demands are demands that are basically anti-neoliberal. The main idea is we are fighting against the elimination of the subsidies, even if we want to go to a post-petrol society. They say it explicitly, but that's it. There are not much other demands. The other demands that appear are reactive to, well, members of the government saying stupid things, like the Minister of Defense that says there are no indigenous territories in Ecuador, and there are legally indigenous territories, and obviously they protest this thing. Police violence that's going on 2019, we are in the internet age, and we can follow live how policemen, police people are beating up protesters, how tanks are on the streets, even if the defense minister says there are no tanks on the streets because of tank, it's just a, I don't know what the technical term it is, but well, there are tanks, you can see them. So the demands are, well, basically around anti-neoliberalism. This is connected to a wide coalition of organizations and individuals participating in this uprising between, well, the indigenous movement, followers of Rafael Correa, worker unions, labor unions, young leftists, university students, and so on. So on. And this uprising of October 2019 is a moment when the influential leader of nowadays of CONAIE, Leonidas Issa, makes a public appearance. I just put up the book he co-wrote with some other people of the movement, Estallido. And this book is, for once, a turning point, published in 2020, like a few months after the uprising, and analyzing the uprising. This book is like the moment of appearance of one organization that is a bit complicated to understand because it's not a formal organization, but it's influencing the indigenous movement, and it goes beyond the indigenous movement. There is some kind of movement of Mariatiguistas, which connects my university with the indigenous movement, with other leftist places and spaces, and move the discourse more to a Marxist left, something that was not as present before as it is now. This is also why the title of my presentation, which is taken from Issa et al. This put up the last part of his book, so it's the last final phrases, and he says, well, Indo-American communism or barbary would be like the future to come. Shortly after, Issa becomes president of CONAIE and moves the discourse more towards a socialist platform, the Marxist platform, not referring as much or hardly at all to concepts as plurinationality, buen vivir, indigenous nationalities, territoriality, all those central concepts of the discourse of before became, well, they are moved to a second, to the background, let's say. They do not disappear completely, but the discourse, a discourse around socialist and even communist ideas that connect to the urban poor, especially, is much more important now than it was before. And this becomes visible in the uprising of June 2022, the longest uprising ever in Ecuador since modern times, with, again, deaths, protesters, injuries, a lot of people arrested, and so on and so on. This time, this uprising was planned beforehand, for months. It was planned because the negotiations with the government failed, and the indigenous movement said, well, we're going for an uprising. Mark June 13th in your calendar, basically. So it started with 10 demands defined beforehand, like written in a letter to the government, and diffused on social media, and so on and so on. Those 10 demands are around 3 dimensions. Economic issues, think of poverty, an increase in crime and insecurity, and so on. Anti-neoliberal demands, it is again against well, the elimination of subsidies, of petrol, gas, and so on. Anti-extractivism and the protection of indigenous territories is present, but only as 2 of the 10 demands. So it becomes moved, like I said, into the background. Once again, we have a wide alliance with a lot of non-indigenous people participating in the protest, but this time the Correistas are not as present as before. In October, they were really there and participating and so on. In June, not so much. It was more like they were participating from the parliament, but those are street protests, not parliamentarian protests. So we have a move in the last few years towards a much clearer socialist, Marxist platform of demands and a alliance politics that connects not so much to ecologism or environmentalism, but rather to typically unorganized leftists, workers, university students, also indigenous communities in the major cities that are not as connected to the movement as rural communities. So we have a move towards a rather socialist platform in what happens with indigenous movements. Now we can understand that, for a lot of Quechua, following Benjamin Inuka, indigenous intellectual academic who died late 2019, as Yachatinqui. Yachatinqui would be the struggle, the confrontation and convergence of knowledges. He understands the development of the indigenous movement as a, well, not a sequence, but a different types of struggle about knowledge that, well, define different moments of the movement. The time I didn't present here in the 1970s before, with indigenous movement developed as such, as indigenous people understood themselves as political actors, is understood by Inuka as Richarimui Tingui, which would be like the confrontation and conversion of awakenings and memories. The 1990s uprisings would be the Raparishun Tingui, confrontation convergence through uprisings. You have political action, and indigenous movement present their way to understand things, their knowledge, as something contraposed against the dominant knowledge of the state, of the politics, of the political parties, of the parliament, president, and so on and so on. At the same time, you have Kausai Pura Tingui, which would be like interculturality, the confrontation and confluence between cultures, which is connected to education, which is connected to language politics. Which as well is the moment where the indigenous people can present their culture and, well, connect to the dominant mestizo culture as a proper actor with respect, supposedly, but we didn't really come to this. And the model of Inuka ends with Summa Causa Tingui, which would be the fight after the Constitution of 2008, where the nationality, summa causa, buen vivir are included into the Constitution and government politics, which would be like a confrontation and confluence around or about buen vivir, where happens what I already told you. The government has its concept of buen vivir, which is connected to development and well-being, reduction of poverty, and so on and so on, while the indigenous movement and indigenous communities have their idea of summa causa, which is much more connected to community, including the non-human community. So we have two different concepts, two different understandings connected to the same concept. Now, Inuka died in 2019. He was not able to develop reflections on the uprising of October. So I take the liberty, and supported by several people who know Quechua way better than I do, I think that the later times, 2019, 2022, and the uprising that will come maybe this year, probably this year, would be a new and later stage of Yacheting, of struggle about knowledges. Now I have problems pronouncing this. Kikinkulkilika. much I think we saw. You only know what written, which would be this king thing, means neoliberalism. It really put us really a problem to come up with this word. Some translator, official translator, Jose Kaiser of the parliament, who helped me with this idea. I think that nowadays the major conflict that defines the indigenous movement and what it does publicly and politically is the confrontation, the fight against and on neoliberalism. How neoliberalism changes society. So I think, we are witnessing a move much more towards a socialist platform of the indigenous movement. Thank you so much.
Read that much, but I think it was necessary to establish some of the most important points of it. Between the 5th and 13th of December 1988, in the small city of Papantla in northern Veracruz, was held an ambitious 9-day cultural and social exposition named plainly as Expo Vainilla, with a multiplicity of activities dedicated to perhaps its most well-known and most discursively ubiquitous product, vanilla beans and its derivatives. The expo did not only move thoroughly in the vicinity municipalities and rural areas of the cultural area known as the Totonacapan, but brought together a wide range of social sectors that included local politicians, non-state vanilla promoters, agronomists, farmers, vanilla traders, anthropologists, biologists, and even a senior women organization in charge of serving vanilla dishes. To a lesser degree, recognized indigenous groups such as Totonacs, which are the historical enablers of the cultivation and harvesting of this tropical orchid in the region, were in the program. More interestingly, the offer of activities consisted not only in specialized lectures for the economic, technical, and natural aspect of this multifaceted object, but also culinary and art exhibitions, civic ceremonies, and speculator as can it sound, a ballet play, a beauty pageant for the Queen of Vanilla, and even sport activities to celebrate this spice. Organized by the municipal government, tourist and development offices, Veracruz State's government committee called Sistema Producto Vainilla, which later will become the Congreso Veracruzano de la Vainilla, and the federal and regional divisions of the Dirección General de Culturas Populares, which was previously the Instituto Nacional Indigenista. In these 9 days, Expo Vainilla recreated and developed a rich gamut of scientific, economic, and even socially and culturally entertainment activities that portrayed the multiple and created and recreated realities by the Papantla's social sectors. These sorts of activities were far from new in the region. These efforts sought to convey the omnipresent character of vanilla among Papantecos, but most especially to build positive notions of identity, but they did it so by inventing cultural practices that neglected and obscured the socioeconomic realities and conflicting dynamics of a crumbling, global, and highly unequal productive economy. Even more, these constructions do not permit, as Emilio Curie pointed out in a 2000 article, to distinguish between the historical realities of the economy of vanilla, but going beyond this, what the rural population, predominantly Totonacs people, experienced during this period and how they understood and gave cultural meaning to this economy. As a form of working hypothesis for my ongoing project, 20th century Papantla socioeconomic and political context was the fundamental ground where local cultural constructions, done primarily by middle-class, educated, and elite Papatecan sectors, directed their efforts for the construction of a local identity matrix by placing vanilla in the relationship with Totonacs as quintessential. In addition to these activities enlisted like in Expo Vainilla, they relied also on historical writing and literature forms like myths and legends, as well as plastic arts, to create idioms and spaces where an invented history of vanilla convey the continuity and positive social aspect that the Totonacs had regarding this economy. In conjunction with parallel process and elements such as the city name Flying Man dance ritual, the voladores, or the heritage notions of the epic classic archaeological site of El Tajín, well studied, the latter by the interdisciplinary work of Samuel Holy Klein and Monica Salas Landa, these constructors omitted or quickly passed the page to more complex and conflicting previous and contemporary historical realities of the region. As a takeaway, I consider that this construction was a key process to better understand notions of indigeneity, most especially Totonacs, but also the highly unequal relationships created with this indigenous group. This was an operation of a narrative that continues to be undisputed to this day. For all the mentioned above, I chose Papantla as a political entity, as it was only Papantla, the only place where they insisted on this forms of tradition. And while these notions are shared in the region, Papantecos, or the people where they grew in Papantla, have been the most insisting of this type of narratives that highly do not recognize how this economy was built and how developed, most especially in the 20th century. So in my outline, I've worked already with the main ideas of this presentation, and I will start to move to what I would say is the background, as it is important to explain to all of you what is vanilla and what was the political economy of the 20th century in the region. What we understand as vanilla is mainly an orchid that is endemic to the Americas, where there's 300 species, but only 3 of them are productive. So what we can get as the vanilla bean, or the derivatives as a highly concentrated extract. This is the vanilla andrews or planifolia, and this is predominantly existing in Central or Northern America in the limits of the tropics. And it was shared not only in Papantla, and it's an important point to raise, but it was found in the jungle within a really high or big area. It is really a complex process that I will not go into detail, but vanilla requires a specific type of conditions of growth and also fertility. But in the most cases, it will require 3 years, and then we'll have a 5 years production where they will be needed to be pollinated, and we'll start to grow a bean that will be like the one on the left, that will then need to go to a curation process. Historically speaking, this was done by Totonacs people, which they had some connections or trade with Aztec Empire, but it was mainly done by a recollection basis, and it went on until the 19th century predominantly. The 19th century was a changing century, as Emilio Curi has studied, as it created a pressure where different commercial, trading, fiscal, political, and cultural aspects started to operate in order to create a globally linked economy where Papantla started to stood out. I must say that it was not the first center of production, as Misantla, a municipality that is a little bit south from the map that we can see, started to operate within these years. However, by mid of the 19th century, Papantla started to gather all the forces, socially, politically, even environmentally speaking, to put more pressure in the accessibility of land that required big extensions of cultivation of vanilla. However, Totonacs or contemporary Totonacs had a leading role, as they were the main cultivators of this spice. Or in this sense, it was a highly racialized or divided forms of labor, where Totonacs were the main cultivators, but not the traders of this business. This is a point that I would like to start to raise. As you can see on the left, merchants from Papantla, which had connections to or were migrants from Europe, predominantly Spanish and Italian, in some cases French, but they situated in what is now San Rafael, Veracruz, started to gather the pieces for constructing a business that will link directly to the United States, most predominantly after the Civil War. And I'm not going to go into the details of the 19th century economy, but most importantly, This created a whole set of transformations in terms of land and uses of land, most notably a switch between a communal structure of land to a private one. By the beginning of the 20th century, this created an opening of a different set of activities, cattle raising, oil extraction, timber extraction, and went on well beyond the 20th century until the 20th decade. As you can see with the graph, there's still not a lot of numbers about the production of vanilla in Mexico. They're really scattered, and some efforts like the ones of Samuel we've been trying to hold the numbers in different archives, but still they're rather scattered. But this is a projection about how the business went on rather steadily until the 50s, and then it starts to crash pretty clearly in the 60s, 70s, and extending to the 80s. It must be said that Papantla is not the only sole of center of production of vanilla, has been displaced by colonial contexts like the ones in Africa, but also in southern East Asia. And this is the socioeconomic context that has been experienced in numbers, but in other aspects, there is a high concentration of monopoly among vanilla traders in Papantla, but also a lot of violence. There's an aspect that it needs to be worked, as there's so many references about violence that you can find in newspapers, in Mexican newspapers, which talked about how there's been a rising and continuous seasons of violence, especially during harvest season. There's the possibility of finding records in the well-known DFS, or Dirección Federal de Seguridad files, which talked about how rural violence was rather common in the region. However, this also was contested by different notions of economy, most notably by oil extraction, with the case of Costa Rica as a contestant for the role of the economic direction that will have the region. However, then what this paper is trying to talk about is the different notions that Papantecos is starting to build with vanilla during the 20th century, most notably in the second half of the century. And I start with an important member of who constructed this history, which was the first chronicle, called Luis Salas Garcia. So Luis Salas Garcia was the first appointed cronista or chronicle from the municipality. He was appointed during the government of Isidro Marie. Isidro Marie was a well-known and linked politician in the PRI that had pretty high connections with also not hacendados, but caciques from different areas of the Papantla region. However, Luis Salas Garcia was the first person to start to recollect and create what it can be considered the first comprehensive history of Papantla. And it has the typical tropes of finding the national aspects within Papantla's history, within the pre-Hispanic era, to the colonial, the 19th century, the Reformation Wars, and then to the Mexican Revolution, which was rather weird in this region. However, there's few mentions about the role of communal rebellions in the late 19th century, and they're rather scattered, as they were just responses of communal organization against privatization of land. The second example that I'm trying to bring, it's another one that it's adding to the different ways that the local society is constructing, which is the so-called legend of vanilla. This is the actual statue and plaque that is next to the central square of Papantla, and it has the legend more clearly. I'm not going to go into details about what it brings, but the idea is that there was a connection or a mixing of two royal indigenous persons that were having an affair, and they were desecrating the hierarchies of the region or the gods, and they're hearts were thrown into fire, and then they were created a plant where vanilla started to share or extend its aroma within the world. Interestingly, this legend was recollected by Jose de J. Núñez y Domínguez, which was, as you can read in the description, a diplomatician and a poet, historian, and journalist, which also was linked to the next person that I have, which is Roberto Núñez y Domínguez, which I highly presume it was his brother. Both of them were born and raised in Papantla, although rapidly started to link within higher echelons of politicians and cultural spheres, which also created a tale. This is not a comprehensive history of Papantla, but it is a first sort of description of the traits and characteristics of the peoples that live in this place. And I bring some of the quotes and illustrations as it depicts aesthetic notions about what people should look like, or how indigeneity is portrayed within the imaginations of Papantecos. Some of the important quotes, and I will read it in Spanish, as I think it portrays better the meaning. Recostada como en una hamaca de esmeralda en el verde regazo de los bosques veracruzanos, el amparo tutelar de la milenaria pirámide del Tajín se encuentra en la ciudad de Papantla, cuyo origen arranca de los tiempos del legendario reino de Totonacapan y que desde la época de la conquista tiene el privilegio de perfumar con el capitoso aroma de su vainilla al orbe entero. So there's several ideas or notions playing here. One of them is that there was a realm known as Totonacapan, which is highly disputed archaeologically speaking by historians too, as there's not a proper connection within prehistoric Totonacans and contemporary Totonacans, but also the fact that Papantla is situated as the capital of vanilla since its conception, this is highly problematic in historical terms, as it cannot be proved as a center of production within pre-Hispanic times. On another hand, it also plays that its global ideas are playing here, as it is basically giving vanilla to all over the world. Another quote that I took that I found really interesting is, it says, hablan su lengua ancestral, conservándose étnicamente puros, ya que no admiten mezclarse con gente extraña, por lo que han logrado sostener sus costumbres y tradiciones raciales sin adulteraciones exóticas. Además, entre ellos no hay indigentes, puesto que todos poseen su rancho en el que cultivan la valiosa vainilla que al explotarse va a saturar al mundo con su preciada esencia. And although this text was published in 1952, it was republished in 1971, more interestingly by the state government, and it had a lot of connections with the development of tourism in the region, which is another axis that I've been trying to explain or to better situate, as it was a time where also the archaeological sites of the Tajín and other attractions were starting to pop in the media and a lot of publications or newspapers. Thirdly, I moved to the plastic space, as Papantla also created or got together with the muralist tradition or the muralist movement. This is Teodoro Cano. He lived between 1932 and 2019, and he could be claimed the most well-known plastic artist. He was really related with the muralist school, but more importantly with Diego Rivera's perspectives. And he has hundreds of work spread out in the region and in the state, and some others in the nation. But he was commissioned in 1971 by the same municipal president, Isidoro Marie, to create a mural in the skirts of the actual Church of the La Asunción. It's a pretty long mural that spreads basically from all the sides of the square. And it talks the story about the Totonacan people, or is an homage about their history, which starts from a Quetzalcoatl birth, that it's represented with the maize or the maíz here, and then moves forward to the contemporary history or the whole legacies that have had in the region. In the middle, there's the Tajín niche, or 365 niche pyramid, which is another really emblematic image among the region. But I would like to center in this part, as in this section, it portrays the cohabitation or the good relations that different economic activities had in the region. On the right, it's possible to interpret education. Next to it, there's the maize or the milpa type of economy that the Totonacs did actually have, and it was central to their economy. Next to it, an oil or pair of oil rigs, which in fact did cohabitate, but then in the 30s, 40s, and later on will have to have more problems within contamination and pollution and different sort of agrarian conflicts. Next to it, we will find the vanilla plant, and it's actually held by humans that are embracing these realities within this region. Maybe I move forward, and I would love to hear your questions, but I will try to bring my remarks and I will read them out loud just to have the better definition of the problem. As Papantla's vanilla economy entered the 1960 decade, our stark socioeconomic and political context started to heavily falter the once kilometric vanilla economy that spanned for sunlight during the curation process in their streets, an activity which secured the previous reputation that awarded the motto of the city that perfumes the world. By the 1970s, several social sectors complained in all levels of government and with different sectors the multi-factor challenges that impacted vanilla production in Papantla. And although attempts were made, none of these resulted in a revival of this former global economy. With longer repercussions in the cultural sphere was the set of traditions that took varied elements and characteristics of the cultivation and harvesting of the plant. Having been done historically by Totonac farmers in the northern Veracruz, different social sectors of Papantla society created historical and mythological narratives that found plastic and written products that highlighted the identity character shared among the whole region. In order to do so, they created historical bridges, emphasized cultural traits, and essentialized ethnic values and practices of a complex indigenous group. More tellingly, was the neglect of full omission of the most conflicting and complex result of this vanilla economy, ones that indeed created global bonds, but that it was always impacted by local dynamics and structures of its centers of production. There is few reliable information of the own significance given by Totonacs about the orchid of its economy, and usually it's violence. However, if we still include in the equation the historic labor and environmental role of indigenous Totonac farmers in the enabling of vanilla, it must remain a must to find proper methods and approaches to that on what was and not the cultural value given by this group. And I thank you all, and I'm looking forward for the questions and the discussion.